Food aid, and it's now everybody talked about food aid. Now suddenly, in the last 2-3 years, everybody's talking about food assistance. Is something different happening, or are they just relabelling what they do because it's, in some sense or other, politically more convenient to relabel what you do? We'll come back to that. It's a question. Food aid myself. Somebody asked me how I got into it. We were in Paul and I were in a meeting last week in Potsdam. And I said, well, it's very interesting. My first encounter was food aid. I was acting as an advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture in Bangladesh. And one day, he put a piece of paper on the table. It was a letter from the US Mission Director for Bangladesh. And it said more or less, we think you should do this, 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 and this in agricultural policy. And if you don't, we're going to cut off for food aid. And he said, well, you know, how should we reply to this letter? Of course, he had an idea how, but he was asking me, in a sense, how to phrase his response. So, there once was a time when that was the nature of food aid. It was immensely important. It represented around 25% of all development cooperation. And, of course, it was dominated by the US, which, again, dominated development cooperation. Today, the story is really very different. I'd add a little bit more to this. Presently, food aid is only about 3% of development cooperation. And in the case of a number of agencies, particularly most of the European agencies, it's about 1% or less of their aid budgets. However, it is important for some others. The US, it's difficult to say, but I'd say it's around about 6 or 7% of US development cooperation. And very important, this may explain some of you are here, it represents about 30% of official humanitarian assistance. So very skewed in terms of who is providing it, and very skewed in terms, as Paul's indicated, where it's being used. The other things which, of course, are different now to where they were, and this is in my introduction to the Food Aid Convention. Once upon a time, most food aid came out of agricultural budgets. Now, the greater part of food aid comes out of general aid budgets and the budget lines which are assigned for humanitarian assistance. There are, of course, important exceptions. The US, in the US case, fiscal year 2010, there's about 1.5 billion appropriations under the agriculture budget, and probably about 300 million under the foreign assistance and humanitarian budget, which is much more flexible. So there are, again, important. So in what I'm talking about, what we're dealing with is a very asymmetrical situation, where food aid is very important for some, not important for others, and then the way it's being handled is very different too. So this is the sort of background. The other thing that Paul alluded, about 80% of food aid 2008-2009 is humanitarian assistance. Difficult to be precise because you're not always clear what you mean by humanitarian assistance. Let me give an example. When there are floods and cyclones in Bangladesh, they use the Vulnerable Group Feeding Programme, which is labelled by WFP a development programme. But they increase and provide a large amount of food through that programme, clearly, for the victims of disasters. And this is clearly humanitarian assistance, but it's still labelled as development. So I'd say, in reality, if we were to go through food aid, the amount that is really now humanitarian might be even approximating 90%. Very difficult to say, because there's all the problem of labels, and we keep coming back to labels. So that's something of background. Now, at the moment, the Food Aid Convention is being renegotiated, and I thought it's fair to ask you as an audience, how many of you are familiar with the Food Aid Convention? What can I assume? 3 or 4, you see? How many of you read any version of or a commentary on the draft agreement on agriculture? Okay, so what we're now talking about is a negotiation, an international negotiation on the future of food aid or food assistance, where, as you can see amongst yourselves, very few are acquainted with the details. And the reason I drafted the background paper, which I put on all your desks, is because actually you can't even assume a familiarity with the detail, even in agencies which are responsible presently for food aid, food assistance. Because actually, if it's only 1% of your aid budget, it's quite likely, and given the rotation of personnel, that there may be a severe problem of institutional memory in many institutions about what actually you're responsible for. So, okay, so All I would say, in the background paper, I won't talk through this now, little time, it does go through these things. It provides you quite a bit of background about the Food Aid Convention, about the negotiation process, and in particular, its links to the WT Doha Development Round Agreement on Agriculture Process. You say, goodness me, humanitarian aid, food aid, what's he got to do with all that? But actually, it is all caught up with it, because if you think about it, one of the things about food aid, particularly if it's provided by donors, it comes from their markets. And there's an issue, potentially, of export competition or trade distortion. And as long as you have that kind of food aid, that problem is there and that linkage, and there's an issue to be addressed.
Can you just...
Is it, sorry, it's not working. Okay, so is the FAQ working? Well, of course, the question with the FAQ, and I'm not going to speak exactly to the PowerPoint because PowerPoints are mandatory, but it doesn't necessarily mean as a speaker you ought to be inflexibly tied to your PowerPoint, particularly when you're speaking second. What I would say with regard to the FAQ and where it is now, what we have to understand is that originally it was agreement in 1967, and it was last negotiated in 1999 amongst a limited number of parties that they would provide annually minimal amounts of food aid. The parties were the US, the largest contributor, the European Union collectively, because the Food Aid Convention is an agreement that was originally negotiated as a part of a trade agreement. The European Commission acts for all the member states, just as it does in the WTO. They are not all represented individually. Australia, Canada, Japan, Norway, Switzerland. And you can see this is broadly, therefore, it's a formation of the DAC group of donors, more or less. One or two missing, but they're all there directly, or in the European case, indirectly. What they committed in 2009 was approximately 5.4 million tonnes of food aid measured in terms of wheat equivalent, whatever that might mean, annually. And that included, on the part of the European Union, 125 million ECU as a contribution to the purchase of food. So it wasn't all quantitative, some of it was cash. So that's the situation. The agreement continues. Oh, can we get Paul? Okay. Before we go on to that, we have to say, well, that's what the commitments were. What do we know about what's going on? There are 3 lines on the graph. And what I'd have to say is, in reviewing the FAQ for undertaking this background paper, what I found is that no one had attempted a quantitative analysis of the impact of the Food Aid Convention since my colleague Charlotte Benson in 2000. Because though there's an international agreement, there's no requirement for monitoring, assessment or peer group review. So if you want to know what the Food Aid Convention, what we know about it, you'd have to go back to this volume, Olaf Stocking and myself, 2000, and the paper by Charlotte Benson, in which she tries to quantitatively assess the performance of the convention. So what I'm doing here is merely set up the issues for investigation rather than providing answers. The blue line indicates the quantitative commitments of food aid, and you notice that it's an L-shaped curve, because in 1995 it dropped sharply, because in 1995 some of the donors, faced with a global food price hike, simply decided to reduce their commitments under the convention. So the commitments fell from 7.5 million tonnes to just around 5 million tonnes. I have to say, at that point, and when we wrote before, I thought, well, if you make commitments and when it becomes inconvenient to sustain those commitments, you simply drop them, then there's a serious question about the value of those commitments. The second line indicates the reported contributions to the FAQ. And what you will see is it's fairly unstable, it's volatile, it's closely associated with movements in commodity markets. So you see there's a dip in the mid-90s, and then there's another dip in 2007, 2008. The green line, now that's interesting, because the green line is total food aid, including other donors. So what we now have, you can see, is food aid is even more volatile. Up to the new convention in 1999, you can see that the contributions under the Food Aid Convention were less than total food aid measured physically. But since the new convention, we have an extraordinary situation where apparently more food is being contributed under the Food Aid Convention than the World Food Programme reports physically as quantities of food aid. All I would suggest to you is clearly that there are serious problems here. Even more so because, as you can see, if you look at the green line, levels of food aid globally were higher during the food price spike in the late 90s than they were during the most recent one in 2007-2008. But apparently, Food Aid Convention contributions were higher than they were a decade before. So what we have here is a commitment, a way of measuring the commitment, which is very difficult to relate to what's actually going on in reality. So that's as background to the negotiations. We don't exactly know what's going on because nobody is assessing it officially, but when we try to look at what's going on, we raise more questions than we can find answers. Yes. Where are we now? The story's moved on from Paul's story about dodos and those committed to renegotiation, because in April, the DAC development ministers committed themselves that they believed in the importance of a food aid convention. And notice it focused on providing appropriate and effective food assistance, whatever that might mean, to vulnerable populations, whatever that might mean, and that the ministers have agreed to do more work. So if you like, collectively, the G8, and by implication therefore the DAC group as well, have in fact committed themselves to renegotiate, and so the issue about whether there will or won't be a food aid convention seems to me is now academic. I think having made that commitment, it's very unlikely that there will not be a convention. And the signatories in June agreed to extend the convention up to 2011 mid-year in order for informal discussions followed by formal negotiations to take place. So that's the present position. Where does that lead us? Well, the first issue to do with the Food Aid Convention is to say, so far all the discussions have been informal. That is, there is nothing in the public domain about those discussions and the substance of those discussions. So one of the things today and indeed last week, it's an opportunity to begin to open out that discussion, because this is something which potentially impacts on, influences what organisations are doing, humanitarian agencies, UN, NGOs, what governments are doing. And where we are at the moment are informal discussions amongst a small group of parties using language which is coded and not at all clear what it might mean. I suppose all I would then go on to suggest, given our experience of previous negotiations of the Food Aid Convention, one should be aware of the kind of TINA principle, the assumption that somehow or other there's only one way in which it can be done, and that there might in fact be, at this point, opportunities to go in quite different directions. Well, the first issue, and I won't go into the details of it, but bear in mind there is presently a link between the Food Aid Convention and the WTO process. We have to ask, is there a need for a freestanding international treaty about food aid or food assistance which is linked to the WTO process? Is that any longer necessary? Well, all I would say is, again, if you are following the WTO process, they've reached a stage now where they themselves have worked out a draft on what food aid might be and how it might be handled under a future agricultural agreement. The draft modalities on agriculture, possible future article to replace the current article of the Agreement on Agriculture on International Food Aid. And it contains no brackets. In other words, it's all, in their language, agreed. So if that were to happen, that tells you how food aid is relates to and how it's dealt with under the WTO. So the first question, does it any longer need to be this freestanding agreement under the International Grains Council in London, or could it be, alternatively, linked into the wider architecture on development cooperation or the wider architecture on food security? That you don't need this freestanding arrangement in London. So that's the first question. Now, all I would again say, I'm going very quickly, the typical presumption is because it's about food, it ought to be part of the food security architecture under the Rome institutions. But one would have to say, wait a minute, the Food Aid Convention is a funders' agreement about aid. Most of it is general aid, and if that's true, ought it not to be considered more logical that this ought to be an agreement which relates to all the other agreement on development cooperation and the effectiveness of development aid, which all sit under the OECD in Paris? I won't go into the details, but I think one could legitimately pose that question, that might be an alternative route to go. Objectives as of the points in the negotiation. Well, the primary objective of the Food Aid Convention as it exists is to act as a form of risk transfer mechanism, which in effect means that donors collectively agree to ensure that there are certain amounts of food aid that would always be available, quite irrespective of market conditions, currency fluctuations, or indeed their own budgetary process. So it is in fact a kind of risk transfer mechanism in which the contingent liability is being accepted by the donors. And the question, is that a continuing useful role, bearing in mind that most of this is now directed towards humanitarian food assistance? Well, of course, we have to look at how it's performed, but it seems to me that's a genuinely possible convincing argument for continuing some form of agreement, because it means that certain levels of resources might be available. Now, others in the discussions have said, well, of course, there are other reasons for having a Food Aid Convention, because if you have a Food Aid Convention and you made a commitment, that means agencies have to budget for food. And if they have to budget for food, it has to go somewhere. And in reality, organisations like WFP and many NGOs depend on the presumption that that will happen. So indirectly, the convention might act as a way of providing continuing resources to those institutions. And certainly that's the argument they are making in the renegotiation process. A third argument, which Paul mentioned, we'll have to say, is that because donors collectively made a commitment in the past, they can't abandon that commitment, because it would look so embarrassing. I don't think that really, we should take that one seriously, because they've already agreed to continue with it. The other issue, which I think ought to be now dropped altogether, is under the WTO Uruguay round, it was said that food aid and the Food Aid Convention could be a way of helping low-income food deficit countries to meet some of the adjustment costs of the trade negotiation process. That was 1994. We're now in the year 2010. Nothing has ever happened on that score. The resources which are being committed under the convention are now almost entirely to humanitarian aid. Unless one were to envisage a massive increase in the resources that could be available, clearly it cannot address that problem. It cannot address trade-related adjustment problems of economies. Indeed, these have been addressed in other ways. And if that were dropped, then that would also imply one of the key ways of dropping the links to the WTO process. So, objectives. The next question is in terms of, if you have objectives, what should be the nature of the commitments? Should they be in physical or financial terms? Now, what I want to say here, bear in mind, this is not about tying aid in the sense of food that's going to be procured on the donor market. What we're talking about now are commitments of specific quantums of aid or financial resources to food assistance. and then guaranteeing these in real terms against volatility in commodity currency markets and changes in donor budgets. That's the implication of the commitment. Now, all one can say at the moment, what we've got are these wheat equivalent, whereby various kinds of commitments, whether they're in cash or in commodity terms, are converted through a very complex process into wheat. And why wheat? Because, of course, when they negotiated the agreement in the first place, most food aid was wheat. That's no longer true. Wheat is probably now about 25-30% of food aid at the most. So that's one of the questions. What should be the nature of the commitment? Should they be physical commitments or should they be financial commitments? We might come back to that. The next question, if there is to be a convention, how can it be properly monitored? How can there be an assessment built into the process? And how can there be some assurance that people do actually do what they've committed themselves to do? For example, currently in the case of the European Union commits itself to so much commodity aid and so much cash for food aid. We don't know exactly who is doing what. All we can work out is somehow or other the whole European Union last year got close to meeting its commitment collectively. But what the responsibility of the Commission was, what the responsibility of the French government was, the German government, the British government and so forth, we actually don't know because they don't even declare that. So I'd say there is a transparency issue in here. So that's something. And also, if it's an agreement which is to be taken seriously, on what basis can we hope that it will be taken seriously? Now, what I would suggest here, based on the previous work which we've done on the DAC, and I have to say here, I'm coming close to finishing, is when I started to look at the DAC agreement on tying of aid, I was a sceptic. I thought, goodness me, this is a voluntary agreement. It's probably not to be taken very seriously. But when we got into investigating this, the interesting thing was, in the report which you'll find on the table, this is the summary version of the DAC, and there's a fuller version which you can obtain, Untying Aid. What we found was that because of that peer group process and the regular annual reviewing of the performance of members of the agreement, that actually it worked quite well as a way of ensuring that people lived up to their commitments. Agencies like Australia and Canada actually changed their aid legislation to enable them to untie their aid, and so on and so on. So what I would say is, if we want a process which is likely to work, then peer group review might be a better way of doing it than thinking you can have some kind of binding international treaty which commits you to do something in some wholly inflexible way. In reality, there will be no such treaty because it would never get past the US Congress. They would never ever agree to that kind of commitment of themselves. Lastly, and this is a personal view in terms of what the convention, if it were to continue, look like, it seems to me what we have to do is to say, will these commitments be seen as something which is tangible and that can be understood in the funder constituencies and indeed more widely? Because to say you're providing 5.4 million tonnes of wheat equivalent of food aid actually is completely opaque. And it does seem to me what one has to say in the renegotiation is there some way in which those who are signatories to the agreement can collectively commit themselves to funding something which means something more. That's collectively. And an example I offer in the background paper, you could say, for example, they commit themselves collectively to funding every year to provide enough cash and food to allow, let's say, 20 million crisis-affected people to meet their food needs. That's a collective commitment, and that's something that they're then trying to do together, which is accessible. Now, of course, because of US congressional restrictions on what the US can do, it's probably the US will commit itself to providing commodity aid. It's probable that the European Union will commit itself providing financial aid. So in other words, what each of them do in relation to that overall commitment, that is another and difficult issue. But it does seem to me, if we are to have a food aid convention in the future, it has to have some meaning in terms of what it's intended to achieve. And presently, they've said they believe in a convention. They've said that they're going to consider it. And what I would suggest is the first thing they have to do is to clearly about what the objectives are and to express those objectives and what they're committing themselves to do in relation to those objectives that have some meaning that the wider development and humanitarian community, or indeed stakeholders in their own funder countries, can understand. And lastly, it seems to me, we're in a world now where only 80% of the food aid, as Paul referred to, is provided by DAC donors. We have to think in terms of some sort of agreement which perhaps also brings in other funders that they can participate in, as well as those who are already members of the... So, there we are. I've gone through this a great rapid speed. I apologise if I've assumed too much in terms of what you understand about the Doha Development Round, the specifics of the Food Aid Convention, but if you feel you're more interested, you have an opportunity to look at it a bit further in terms of the background paper, which presently and substantively is the only document on the table, apart from 3 press releases, which are each of 2 paragraphs in length in terms of a commitment to negotiation. So it's a process which is taking place. It's a completely non-transparent process, both in terms of how it's being done and in terms of what they're aiming for, other than these very, very limited statements. And the first of these, it's a commitment to provide food assistance. And that takes us back to the beginning of our discussion. What on earth do we mean by food assistance?
Thank you, Ed.
Sorry,